Good afternoon, ladies and gentlemen. Welcome back after lunch. Now, I recognise that the majority of people in the session have been here before, but I do know that a person who hasn't attended before from the County Council has joined the session for 13A this afternoon. So I am just going to do a very quick introduction. Now, my name's Yvonne Wright. I'm one of the inspectors appointed to examine the local plan, and my colleague, Mr. Warden, is also present here today.
Good afternoon, everybody.
Thank you. Now, I'll be leading this session this afternoon, but Mr. Warden will very much be included if you've got any questions or may join the discussions where necessary. Now, we will be having a break around mid-afternoon. Hopefully, let's see how it goes. I'm anticipating this is actually a fairly shortish session. I know we have a number of sessions to go through, individual sessions to go through, but there aren't an awful lot of questions that certainly I've got on some of the policies, so we may not linger on those too much. But let's just see how it goes. But if we do have a break, it's usually around 3 or 3:30, around that time. So if that is necessary. What I'm going to do, because we have such a small number of people here, I'm going to suggest that we just introduce ourselves all at the beginning. It's not like this morning, there was a larger group that wanted to deal with a certain suggestion. That doesn't mean that anybody can be involved in all the discussions, because that would be unfair. But if I could start introductions with the council first, please, and then it just saves a bit of time. Thank you.
Good afternoon, ma'am. I'm Paul Shedder-Revian, QC, acting for the council.
Thank you.
Good afternoon, Inspector Phil Drain, Brentwood Borough Council.
Thank you.
Good afternoon, Inspector Jonathan Quilter, Street Planning Manager at Brentwood Council.
Thank you.
Good afternoon, Inspector Tom Huang, Senior Policy Planner, Brentwood Borough Council.
Thank you. Anybody else from the council?
On mute.
They're on mute, yes. Both on mute. Who
Maybe
wants
stuck
to go
on
next
mute.
from the council?
Afternoon, inspectors. I'm Andrea Pearson, Brentwood Borough Council.
Sorry, was I on mute? Kay Polaris for Brentwood Borough Council.
Thank you. And if I can just go down now for 13A, I've got West Horndon Parish Council. Mr. Phone, yes?
Yes, Councillor Colin Phone, West Horndon Parish Council.
Thank you. And also the Essex County Council is going to be present there.
Good afternoon, everyone. Yes, Rich Cook, Principal Spatial Planner at Essex County Council.
Thank you. So is there anybody else for session 13A? That's who I've got on my list. Yes. Mr. Ratcliffe, are you in 13A, Mr.
Yes.
Ratcliffe?
I think I'm in all these afternoon sessions, so thank you very much. Yes, it's Bill Ratcliffe from Blackmore Village Heritage Association.
And then 13B, I've got Mr. Minot down.
Yes, that's Philip Minot, a local councillor, but not acting as a local councillor in these sessions.
Thank you. And I think that's it, unless I've missed anybody. If I have, then please put your hand up and let me know. No, I think that's it for this afternoon. Right. OK. Now, as I said this morning, we will be starting the session with with 13A. Sorry, just got my papers out of order there. So I'm going to go down the list. So we've got 13A, then we've got 13B, then we're going to do 13C and 13G. Now, we don't have any participants for the last two sessions, so I imagine that those are going to be quite short, unless we have quite a lot to discuss in relation to just between the inspectors, the council and ourselves as inspectors. But I don't anticipate that being those sessions being too long. So it's the first two sessions first, where we've got some other participants present. And again, as I said this morning, it's in relation to our issue 14. So have that in the back of your mind when we are going through this. I'd first like to start with matter 13A and policy SPO3. That's where I would like to go on with this. I recognise that this morning there might have been some confusion as to when this was going to be discussed, but we had two questions set out in our MIQs on this. So really what I'd like to, and what we've asked as part of our question 170 on this particular policy, is to understand the council's approach to this before we then look at the suggested. There are some suggested changes that are set out in your F9A document, which we can move to there. So if the council could just run through and summarise the purpose of the policy and how it is to be applied, that would be really useful, please.
Yes, Inspector, I can take that question. So the policy was determined that it was needed based on conversations with colleagues from Essex County Council. Brentwood Borough Council is part of the Essex Planning Officers Association, which through there they have developed a HIA guide. At the time that the policy was drafted, that document was still in draft and hadn't been finalized. Since then, further work has been done, and that's part of the reason why there's the amended text for within the supporting text, making reference to the guidance to be able to help developers know as to what is expected. It was suggested by colleagues at Essex County Council that that link should be included in case any further updates are made in the future. But the policy itself that's within the council's pre-submission local plan, as for the minimum requirements, is set out through the EPOA, which was that developments of 50 or more units or non-residential developments that are more than 1,000 square meters should do an HIA, but that HIA would be encouraged for anybody putting forth an application just to make sure that it takes in consideration health and well-being as a whole.
Thank you. So can I bring in Mr. Cook here, please? Mr. Cook, is this your area of expertise?
Yes, I'm actually based within the County Council's planning team, although I do work very closely with the public health function, and I've been involved with similar cases for local plans in other parts of Essex in relation to providing that link between planning and public health.
Okay, so from your perspective, could you just summarise your approach and how you have been involved in coming forward and assisting Brentwood Borough Council with this proposed policy and its approach to requiring health impact assessments?
Certainly. Well, the whole question of the public health requirements in relation to HIA process have been around for a relatively substantial period of time. So the original EPOA, Essex Planning Officers Association guidance, to which Ms Pearson referred was actually developed initially back in 2008, and that was produced as an aid memoir, as a guide for local planning authorities in developing policies around health impact assessment and applying those in practice through the development process. So the whole area of guidance has been in place for quite some substantial period of time. The County Council has been working with local planning authorities, including Brentwood Council, in developing their local plans, putting representations in on those draft policies, seeking the inclusion of these policies and appearing examinations wherever necessary. So discussions were taking place over a period of quite some time during the development of Brentwood's plan, during which the County Council advised on the kind of form of policies that it would like to see included within the plan and the means of implementation, making sure that the relevant evidence is signposted, as well as the relevant guidance, and also critically the relevant health and wellbeing strategies. One of the most important things in this area is that health and wellbeing strategies not only give a very good overview of the relevant evidence within these areas, but they need to be implemented and delivered through local plans and the planning process. But in the same time, those health and wellbeing strategies underpin and inform the local plan process and the policies. So it's a two-way situation. So certainly we've looked at the relevant health and wellbeing strategies for this district, both at the Essex-wide level as well as at the district level, the borough level, if you like. And both of those things are instrumental in shaping the form of the policies and the policy approach that has been recommended to Brentwood Borough Council in this case. The form of the policies that's been developed was done in close consultation with the County Council, and the Essex County Council public health practitioner was, rather quite happy with the form of the policy as they emerged, and the County Council has supported the inclusion of this policy in its current form throughout the evolution of the local plan.
Thank you. That was very useful to give that background and understanding that, and I certainly recognise from the submissions that have been made that that the guidance has been around for quite a while, quite a number of years, as you said, from 2007. So thank you for that clarity. Can we just look at the policy in a bit more detail then, please? If we can look at your F9A suggested changes, because I think these are necessary, or certainly some of them are, because the wording at Part A is very much a statement rather than in the submitted policy SPO3 is very much a statement rather than setting out what a requirement would be for any development proposal or any applicant coming forward or any decision maker. So I certainly that certainly makes sense to make those proposed changes in that context.
Yes, ma'am, they were taken out because they're simply not a policy requirement.
So in terms of this, and again, it's this justification for HIAs would be required for 50 or more units or non-residential developments in excess of 1,000 square metres, etc. That is within the Essex guidance as to that's set out there. Is that correct?
I think so, yes, that's right.
So you're proposing basically to take out what was in the statement and put it in the supporting text?
Yes, exactly so.
Understanding. Okay. Right. And in terms of the implementation of this, as the County Council has been very much involved in this, who would be assessing this aspect? Is it a joint effort, or does the Borough Council have expertise to ensure that this policy is implemented in the correct way, or will it very much be a joint effort with the County Council?
I'll ask Andrea to confirm.
Thank you.
It was my understanding that at the local government level, we would have to ensure that an HIA had been undertaken. So part of the validation checklist, that document was there. But then those proposals would be passed on to colleagues at Essex County Council to review, because they're the ones with the expertise in being able to assess if the HIA is complete. I'm not sure if Mr. Cook is able to provide any further information on that.
Certainly, yes, thank you. Yeah, I think the key point there is that it is a partnership, it is a joint effort in relation to identifying those requirements and how they're addressed. So firstly, we have the validation list requirements, which I understand are operational within Brentwood Borough Council to give an initial flag to planning applicants that HIA may be required according to the scale and nature and complexity of their planning application. Certainly the requirements can also be flagged up at the pre-application stage. That is our preferred approach, because it means that generally a more informed process can evolve, that applicants are assisted greatly if they understand what the requirements are in relation to HIA very early on in the process before an application is finalised. So there's those stages there. Also, then when an application comes in, there's also an application checklist approach being developed, a kind of screening system which helps identify the potential scope and nature of the effects that might arise as a result of the proposals. You could think of it as akin to an EIA sort of screening or scoping process, really, and that will flag up to an applicant the nature of the HIA, of the rigour and complexity of the HIA process that's going to be necessary. And I really can't stress quite importantly enough how important it is that a proportional approach is undertaken, both for the benefit of the applicant, but also to make the process and requirements appropriately pitched to each individual proposal. So, for example, with more simplistic, smaller scale applications, where the impacts are likely to be of a less substantial nature, there's much more likely to be a rapid desktop type process being required. And as the scale and complexity of applications increases, then we get more towards a stage of potentially a full-scale HIA, which can be a much more complex and lengthy document, of course. So it's making sure that the right type of process is flagged up to applicants as early as possible in the process, and that needs to be done both through the development management officers working together with county council officers where necessary, but also a practice that the county council has been putting in place for a lot of district councils is to place public health practitioners within each district or borough council, whereby they have some of that expertise in-house and are able to give that slightly greater level of public health expertise into the planning process within each district and borough council itself.
Thank you, Mr. Cook. Can I just clarify whether this is a policy that is strategic in nature or it's a development management policy?
We had put it in as a strategic policy, just because then instead of identifying individual development sites where they would have to do it, if we have applications that come forward that meet that criteria, then they know that then an HIA is required. But on reflection, it probably does make more sense for it to be a development management policy as the plan is read as a whole.
Okay, we'll look at that. If I can just go through the policy wording then in just a little bit more detail, just to clarify a couple of points. Your section C sets out of the policy. I'm looking at the F9A version. Obviously, we've just said that it sets out that an HIA will be required for in relation to housing, 50 units or more, and then non-residential developments. But then in your section B, you specify that Class A5, which obviously doesn't exist anymore, hot food takeaways a HIA will be required there. So can we just explain why that's set out there, and actually, is it clear? Obviously some changes need to be made to that in terms of the use class, but also if you've got, I'm just trying to make sure that the policy makes sense.
Yes. So we did make reference to that in the hearing statements in terms of the use class needing to be changed, so that is acknowledged. In consultation with Essex County Council colleagues when developing this policy, this was something that was addressed in terms of wanting to make sure that there were more healthy food options. And I think this also ties back into some of the conversations we had yesterday with with the takeaways for being their locations close to schools. That partially came from those conversations as well. So these were just basically recommendations that came from Essex County Council on how to deal with hot food takeaways and their impacts to try and make sure there were healthy food choices.
And does it make sense? I'm now looking at figure 1.3 in your plan, because that doesn't list hot food takeaways, and then it has a question mark on C2 use as well. So I'm trying to understand the usability for any applicant coming forward. Will they understand? So it's that consistency between the policy. You've got this figure 1.3, and then obviously you've got the issue of whether it's justified. So, council response, does it need to be in this figure?
Clearly it does. If it's being singled out in the policy, then the table ought to, the flow chart ought to refer to it.
Yeah. I think from our side, that was an oversight because the focus was so much on looking at the text that the figure had actually been created before the completion, and so that's probably where that's accidentally been missed off the figure.
Thank you. And then in part B of the policy, you've got an encouragement element there, which encourages any size of development, not just over the 50 units or over the 1,000 square metres, to illustrate how health and well-being have been considered within the development, but it's not a policy requirement there. You're just encouraging it.
Right.
So again, should that be in policy?
That probably makes more sense for that to go in the supporting text, because the requirement is more for the larger scale developments. But on speaking with Essex County Council colleagues, it was something that they were saying it would be a nice to have in terms of smaller developments could also benefit from going through the HIA process, but it wasn't necessarily a requirement that would be needed.
Okay. Thank you. Thank you. Can I ask the council then to just have a look at that and
yes, we will.
And make those changes? And I would suggest that the use class A5 hot food takeaways either becomes its own criterion or is put in with the other developments, because it sits a bit odd at the moment.
Yes, indeed.
I'll leave the council to just have a look at that without, I know we've had other sessions where we're trying not to change the policy's wording, but this is about the effectiveness of the policy.
Yes. So the reference to hot food takeaways, it doesn't need a use class description, obviously. It's just hot food takeaways can go into C.
Can I bring in Mr. Warden, please?
Thank you, Mrs. Wright. I've just got a couple of questions. On hot food takeaways, the approach taken in this policy is that a health impact assessment would be required to be included within the application for a hot food takeaway. And the policy, as written, says that where there is an unacceptable adverse impact on health, permission will not be granted. I just wonder how that approach relates to the approach that we discussed yesterday, which I know we're going to come back to, about hot food takeaways in close proximity to schools. So that I'm not sure from what I'm seeing that those two approaches are aligned, because what the council is saying in respect of schools, as it was submitted yesterday, is that within 400 metres of a school, hot food takeaway not be allowed. So in that sense, even if a hot food takeaway could show that there was not an unacceptable adverse impact upon health, then the proposal would still be refused. And I'm just trying to see whether the two approaches are actually aligned.
Yes, no, agreed. And I think that's something that as a team we'll need to go back and discuss to make sure that there is better alignment there.
Thank you. Is in the policy there's reference to health impact assessments, and there's also a reference to health and well-being impact assessment. Are they two separate things? Mr. Cook.
Thank you. Yeah, I did notice that discrepancy myself. No, it's one single process. It's just the health impact assessment process. Whereas more generally, when we're talking about this whole area of things, the description of health and well-being tends to often be used to describe the wider considerations. But in the particular terms of the actual process, it's actually health impact assessment. So that reference to health and well-being assessments is actually, I believe, incorrect.
Okay, thank you. So just looking at the beginning of the policy, that the F9A policy proposed suggested changes. It starts off by saying that proposed, and I'm not sure the wording's right here, you might need to look at this, but proposed developments will be required to be assessed for their impacts on health and well-being. So there is, and if I understood you, Mr. Cook, correctly, then that would apply to all development. There's no threshold. So an applicant for one single house, would they require to submit something in terms of health to enable the council to assess it, or does it only apply in relation to that threshold of 50 set out in C?
Well, my understanding of this, I wasn't actually involved in the detailed drafting of the policy wording, but my understanding is that the requirement or the form of encouragement to actually carry out some kind of assessment of effects would be a best practice, good practice type requirement, but not something that could be insisted on reasonably in every single case. So I think the policy intention is that we would like to encourage applicants to undertake at least some form of assessment with a view to improving, developing, refining their proposals and being explicit about what impacts may be on health and well-being, whether they are adverse, positive or unintended consequences, but it would not be a hard and fast policy requirement in every single case. So the guidance within the APOA document was developed to give a good, clear, general indication of what type of process is going to be required in relation to what type of proposal. But my reading of this particular part of the intended policy is that this is more about best practice, good practice, what we would like to encourage applicants to do, rather than are in a reasonable position to require in every single case.
So I think that, therefore, the start of the opening words of that policy are perhaps not right then, because in terms of having regard to the development plan when assessing applications, in respect of that policy, if that policy was adopted, then unless clarified, it would apply to all developments. And I'm not sure that is the case, because you won't be assessing all developments for their impact on health and well-being.
Yeah, there needs to be a reference to the developments which are specified in the remainder of Part B and those in C, just to make it clear. And the supporting text can have a slight amendment to say that in relation to all other developments, people are encouraged to consider these issues and assist the council if it requires further information on those matters. So it can be positive in that way, but without making a requirement other than in relation to the specific type of developments mentioned here.
And in that respect, I wonder whether a reference to health impact assessment to be required within an application which relates to hot food takeaways should not necessarily policy, it's perhaps a statement of what is expected within an application, rather than how that application will be determined.
It does seem rather sledgehammer and nut, frankly, to require a health impact assessment of a hot food takeaway when what we require from them actually is very limited in nature. And as you say, in relation to schools, the matter has already been dealt with in terms of proximity. And it's not for the planning system to dictate what kind of food a retailer should be selling. So we'll certainly look at that. And it may well be that that could be relegated to the supporting text in the same vein of encouragement as other developments.
Thank you, Mr. Shaw-Davian. Thank you, Mrs. Wright.
Thank you, Mr. Warden. Are there any other questions in relation to SP 03? I was going to move on now to SP 05. Now this is a policy that the council have suggested some changes to, as set out in your hearing statement. It's not in F9A, it's in your hearing statement. First of all, and you have confirmed that you don't consider this to be a strategic policy, it is a development management policy. I suppose here I'm trying to understand whether the relevance of this policy when such matters as amenity issues, impact on congestion, roads, construction issues, timings, heavy goods vehicles, frequency of deliveries, etc., noise and vibration, wheel washing, and all sorts of that can be covered by other means, such as through either condition or through other regulations or legislation where it's required. So I'm trying to understand the effectiveness of this policy and how the council will determine this against any application that comes forward, and will use it in determining whether that application is allowed or not. So if the council could just explain that to me.
Sorry, Ma'am. I was just having difficulty getting my mic on.
That's okay, no problem.
The point you raise actually is a good one, even if you look at the proposed amendments in our hearing statement, you will see that some of these things are phrased in the sense of consider the impact of construction of water supply, flood risk, etc. If there were issues in relation to the construction of a particular building or facility, and there were environmental issues and locational issues that required the use of conditions to regulate the means of construction, hours of operation, sheeting of vehicles, etc., then they would be applied through the normal development control regime to make the development acceptable. And I suppose it's also debatable whether one can require developers to use sustainably sourced materials. That is not a planning issue strictly. So these are matters which either are covered by other policies in the plan or are really exhortations, but without any policy requirement. It's very difficult to see how one could, for example, enforce against a developer or require a developer to use sustainably sourced materials if they're choosing to use virgin materials for a particular reason.
Quite. I think that's partly my concern, is that policies should be there to assist a decision maker to either refuse an application, a proposed development, or to permit. And I'm not sure how SP05 can assist that. Because would you use this policy to refuse any proposals coming forward?
No, you'd use it as a means, at the most, as a means of imposing conditions. Because if you determine that planning permission is acceptable in principle for the proposed development, then you have powers to impose conditions to regulate the manner in which the development is carried out. So the question arises then is, what policies do you need to regulate the development? And clearly, if there were potential for construction to cause harm to amenity, to use that phrase, then you would be entitled to impose a condition either to regulate the hours of working or the manner in which the development is carried out. So I think we need to look at this to see if there's anything there in the policy in its original form or as amended to see whether or not whether it's required. And it may well be that other policies have dealt with it appropriately anyway. So we need to look at it.
Thank you. If you come to the consideration that it is still a requirement, I just wanted clarity on what you would expect an applicant to provide to demonstrate all of this.
Yeah, absolutely.
So again, if you can, if you could just have a look at that again as well, that would be very useful.
Yes, we'll do that.
Thank you.
It might be that it can be simply dealt with by an addition to another policy, so we'll have a look at that.
Thank you. Does anybody have any questions on that? No. If we can move then on to policy BE01, which is future proofing. Now, we raised in our question 172 the issues over whether this is a clear policy and whether it clearly set out how a developer or a decision maker applicant would use the policy when determining or putting in a planning application for development. And to my mind, it reads as a statement of intent or objectives rather than a policy. And in response to our MIQ questions, the councillor suggested deletion of this policy as it doesn't provide a very clear steer. So we are content with that. But I obviously want to open up if anybody has any comments they wish to make on that approach. Then by all means, you can say that now. No hands. Okay. Right. On that basis, then I'd like to draw 13A, matter 13A, to a close. So thank you for that. And if you just give me a moment, we will then move on to 13B. Which is the natural environment. And if I've got it correct, I've got Mr. Ratcliffe and Mr. Minot in this session. Right. So let's just bring up the policies. So I'd first like to start on NE01, which seeks to protect and enhance the natural environment. So let me just bring that up. Now, I recognise that Natural England, as a statutory consultee on such natural environment matters, confirms that the policy is in accordance with national planning guidance and the habitat regulations, and that the council has put forward suggested changes in F9A and in the hearing statements. So
yes, ma'am. I think we can ignore the hearing statement and just.
I was about to say that from this morning. So thank you. If we can revert back to that, and then if anything is necessary to ensure consistency and effectiveness, then obviously we can have a look at that. But
indeed. So the proposed change, sorry, I'm anticipating. Again,
No, that's fine. If you want, all I was going to say was if you just want to take me through the wording changes,
yeah,
please.
They are there to bring clarity, and there's one other one I think we need to add, but as a short reference. So the change to, I think what we do need to do, this is an overall comment, these policies have capital A's and then small a, B's and C's, and then go back to capitals. I think we ought to go from capitals then to numbers to make the policies easier to navigate. It's just a general observation.
That's
but
fine,
apart from, but apart from that, if we go to a little b, we've just excluded reference to proposals, green, blue infrastructure. It doesn't mean anything. So we're talking about biodiversity net gain across all development. B, there's a reference there to heritage, and I'm not quite sure what heritage is doing in there, so it's been taken out. So we're talking about the borough's natural designated and non-designated assets.
Well, there is natural heritage, which is not historic heritage. So there is natural heritage, but that I have no issue with that. To lessen the confusion.
Exactly.
We have no issues with taking that heritage out in this context.
That's exactly why it was taken out. Okay. And ditto in C. And net gains in biodiversity to make sure we knew what the net gains were in relation to. Now, large C, small a needs a reference there to compliance with the habitats regulations, because they set out very detailed procedures which don't need to be repeated in the policy for appropriate assessments and habitats regulations assessments. So there needs to be a requirement in there that proposals conform to the requirements of the habitats regulations. Other than that, the only changes there are drafting changes just to make the policy clearer and more effective.
Thank you. And before I come back to some of the wording in the policy itself, you're proposing to amend paragraph 8.19, or you've suggested an amendment to the supporting text to add and refuse if insufficient information is provided.
Yes. Yes, absolutely. That's just to guide developers to know that these matters are so serious that they have to take their responsibilities themselves very seriously in terms of providing the right information at the right time.
Can part B, can the council just clarify what they mean and ensure that the plan is clear on what it means by natural designated and non-designated assets? So is that clear as to, so that anybody who's looking at this policy knows exactly what that means?
Yes, it's a reference to what I say is officially designated assets, and they may be of European, national or local importance, and those which are not officially recognised. So, for example, it may be that a particular natural environment exists in a particular place which has no protection, as it were, by way of a designation, but which nonetheless is of sufficient importance that one has to have regard to the preservation or protection of that asset.
And is that in accordance with the hierarchy that's set out for dealing with habitats and species in relation to international, nationally designated, and the difference in weight in relation to that's set out in national policy?
Yeah, Ma'am, could you direct me to where that is? I can't see it for looking, I'm afraid, in the policy itself.
No, it's where proposals will not be permitted. I'm looking at Part B. Proposals will not be permitted if potentially it will lead to the deterioration or loss by the directorate of. So you're putting all designated and non-designated assets under the same. They will not be permitted. So you're giving them the same weight. So I'm trying to understand, because international sites, such as Ramsar sites and SPAs, etc., would obviously, they have the greatest weight. Then it comes down to national designations, then it comes down to local designations in national policy. So does that reflect that hierarchy in relation?
Yes, I understand the point you're making. Yes, I need to reflect on that to make sure that we are in conformity both with the hierarchy and the MPPF.
I just wanted to understand the council's comments on that.
Yeah, no, I need to check that. Yeah, I'll have a look at that, make sure.
Thank you. But yes, and also make it clear within the supporting text as to what is a designated and what is a non-designated asset in this context as well. If you can have a look at that.
We'll do that too. Yes, absolutely.
Thank you. Does anybody have any comment? Mr. Warden.
Thank you, Mrs. Wright. I just wonder whether the Part A of the policy is appropriate because it talks about supporting proposals. And I wonder whether that is appropriate in the context of the policy.
In a sense that we should be requiring biodiversity net gain, for example. Yeah, I'll have a look at that as well, sir.
Thank you. Thank you, Mrs. Wright.
Thank you, Mr. Warden. Mr. Minot, please.
Yeah. There were some points which I was going to make in relation to NEO 3, but I think actually looking at F9A and what it says, and this capital A lowercase b, the point about biodiversity net gain across all development, which has just been mentioned again. One of the reasons why I wanted to be involved in the discussions of this was because this was raising questions. And I mean, I think to some extent, the question that you asked about, the point that was made about the council putting the same restrictions or talking about the same process for all sites, irrespective of the sort of rating from, sites of special scientific interest, etc., on downwards. I find I'm all in favour of the strength of the wording in these policies. I think they're excellent. The strength of the wording is excellent. But I just, in the real world, I start thinking to myself, well, how does that work in terms of specific examples? And one of the ones that is that comes to my mind as a specific example, as a sort of test case, is R17, the southern part of the Doddinghurst Road site, where it's essentially the whole of that site is regenerated scrub. Therefore, in my view, there's a significant biodiversity value in that site. That is all across the site. And therefore, it just seems impossible to be proposing development on a site of that kind, albeit that it's an interesting test case because it's not even a local wildlife site. It hasn't been properly acknowledged for its wildlife value, but its wildlife value is genuine. But to have the proposal to develop on that site on the one hand, but on the other hand, to have a policy like NE01 and to have that phrasing, it's very difficult to see how you could possibly have biodiversity net gain across within that site, assuming that across all development means we're talking about specific development sites individually rather than some kind of global amalgamation of biodiversity net gain. I don't see how you can have any biodiversity net gain if you're going to be building on a site which has got existing biodiversity value which washes right across the site. It's not about saying, okay, well, this is a site which has got quality biodiversity in one area, and if we start impinging on that, we might do something else in another part of the site to make up what we're impinging on in one area of the site. If you've got biodiversity value across the whole of a site, I don't think you can have biodiversity net gain and at the same time have development. It doesn't seem to be feasible in any real world. So, as I say, I think the policies and I think the strength of the wording in these policies is excellent. I'm all in favour of them. I just don't see how it works in relation to some of the site policies. So then there's a couple of similar points in relation to NE03, but just specifically at this point in relation to that part of it, I'd be interested to know what the bottom line is when all of those factors are taken into consideration, and what the strongest argument becomes, whether NE01 A, capital A, small b, is the thing which has to be taken into account, and therefore when you actually look at certain specific sites, you say, actually, we can't develop this site, or whether it goes the other way around, and because you've got a site allocated, you start saying, well, obviously in this case we can't really apply NE01 Part A, subsection B, and I don't at the moment. I don't know the answer, so I'm trying to find the answer out.
Mr. Ratcliffe, is yours a similar point?
Yes, just really to reinforce it. But other than I rather like the wording, and I particularly liked the way Mr. Shadarivian put it across, because these matters are so serious. Developers have to take their responsibilities seriously. So. Just to reinforce, the same would apply to 2 greenbelt fields in Blackmore that are, in fact.
Well, can we just stay away from specific sites, because I don't think that's relevant. That's not relevant to these discussions. But I take your point, Mr. Ratcliffe.
Yeah, I just want to reinforce though. I like the wording. I wouldn't want to talk anybody out.
So you're supporting the council.
Absolutely, 100%. Just want to reinforce that one.
That's on video, Mr. Ratcliffe.
Thank you very much, Mrs. Ross.
That's okay. Thank you, Mr. Ratcliffe, for that. Can I have a council response to Mr. Minot's points about how can there be net gain on sites that are currently really greenfield sites and have some biodiversity value on there already? That's the main point, irrespective of the actual site that's being discussed. That's what Mr. Minot's point was made, and whether then the policy wording in NE01 actually makes sense.
Well, what will happen first of all, and let's take the hypothetical site just for argument's sake. If there is any indication that the site has value for wildlife or whatever else, then it will be the subject of an assessment to make sure that the proposed development has no harmful effect on what's there. So if it's discovered that there are particular species that are protected there, there will be a requirement to see how the development would impact on that species, whether or not it uses the site for foraging or whether it is habitat for other purposes. And a determination will be made as to whether or not, having regard to any potential impacts, that development is acceptable. That's the first point. That will include consideration of mitigation proposals as well. So that could include translocation of the species. It could include translocation also of plants, etc., valuable or rare flora. So an assessment will have to be made as to whether or not the harm, if it cannot be avoided, can be effectively mitigated, and if it can't be fully mitigated, whether permission ought to be granted because there are compelling reasons to do so. Now, in that process, the Council will also consider the obligation to provide net gain in biodiversity. So, as well as mitigating any loss and making up for that loss, the Council will also look to see how the development itself could invoke measures in terms of its design or layout, which could also enhance biodiversity by creating habitat, for example, or maybe even require some off-site work that might be done to offset the harm and also to provide a net gain. So those mitigation opportunities provide opportunities also to provide a net gain in the measures being proposed.
Thank you.
That's essentially it.
Thank you, Mr. Shadoravian. Can I just come to a point in relation to the additional text that's proposed to the supporting text? So I did bring this up earlier, but was just checking about whether this is actually set out in policy, and then, or whether it should be. So it's the change to the suggested change to paragraph 8.19. So first of all, you're suggesting that if insufficient information is provided, then these applications should be refused. So it's that, again, you've gone through that justification as to why you feel that's relevant, but is that actually set out within the policy? Because that's within the supporting text. So I was just trying to look through to see whether that wording is in there. You've got proposals will not be permitted if potential impacts will lead to the deterioration of blah, you know, etc., etc. But it's that lack of insufficient information which is different. So does the council have a comment on that, or would they like to go and away and just have a think about that point?
Sorry, Mo, I've been talking to you on mute. I will look at that and check for consistency.
Thank you. What I would like to do now, unless there are any further comments on NE01, I would like to move on to some of the other policies that we need to look at. I have no questions on NE02. I don't know if Mr. Warden has any questions on that. Mr. Warden, any questions on NE02?
I don't, Mrs. Wright, thank you.
Okay. So I wasn't proposed to have any discussions on that.
Just to say that I'm so sorry.
No, that's okay. Well, I was just about to say only that you have suggested some amendments to the text of the policy. That sort of updates the position, doesn't it? We're more than happy. That's an update. That's more than happy for that to be included.
Thank you.
So we don't have an issue with that at all. So we're quite happy to move on. If we move on to policy NE03 then, please. Let me just bring up my papers. Now, first of all, I just want to clarify what this policy is trying to achieve and what it relates to in terms of what it's trying to protect, because it's titled Trees, Woodlands and Hedgerows, but then specific reference is made to landscape heritage and other ecological features within the policy, within Part A, including trees, woodlands or hedgerows. So a landscape feature may be something else. It may not be a tree or a woodland or a hedgerow. So I just wanted some clarity as to the purpose of this policy. Is it specifically just for trees, woodlands and hedgerows, or is the council wanting to diversify that out? So it's just the purpose of the policy. If the council could just start on that point, please. And well, and it's the extent of the policy, really. What's it relating to, and then how it will be used in determining planning applications.
It's intended to be directed towards natural features such as just bear with me.
No, that's fine, Mr. Shadaravian.
Trees, woodlands and hedgerows. One because of their value in visual terms, but also in terms of their capacity also to provide habitats. Though it's not intended to replicate or in any way supplement NEO2, which is a standalone policy and has to be a standalone policy. So it may well be that the reference to irreplaceable habitats in the proposed mods ought to be taken out, because clearly habitats are not matters of visual amenity. They come within NEO2. Trees, ancient woodlands and hedgerows are intended to be protected here. So the reference to significant landscape, the loss of a significant landscape or a feature of ecological importance really ought not to appear there, I think, on reflection. So we're talking about trees, ancient woodlands and hedgerows. Landscapes will be dealt with under normal development control policies, and unless there is a protected landscape, then it falls to be considered as a material consideration in much the same way as any other matter, and in accordance with the MPPF. So we need to look at that, and I think A is confusing in that respect.
And then...
So it should refer to significant landscape features in the form of trees, ancient woodlands or hedgerows.
Right.
Which is what it's trying to protect.
Which is what it's about. So it is specifically about trees, woodlands and hedgerows, not other, excuse me, elements.
Yeah. We can't be affording protection to landscapes because that's not the way government tells us to frame our policies.
No. No, that PPG has long gone.
Yeah.
Yes.
So I'll amend that just to make it clearer and to delete references to significant landscape and refer to landscape features such as.
Okay, thank you. The wording in D. So I don't think you're proposed. No, you haven't proposed or suggested a change to this. The loss, threat, or damage to any tree, woodland, hedge, and/or hedgerow will only be acceptable where. I'm a little bit lost as to when would any damage or threat be acceptable? I think it's the wording. I think the wording needs to change. I know what I think you're trying to achieve, but the wording doesn't make sense.
Yes, but also because one might not be able to avoid it at all. So it should be the
and it can be permitted.
And any tree, any woodland, absolutely. Yeah. So
so again, I think I know what you're trying to achieve, and there is obviously a difference between whether something is covered by a protection order or not. I know that is some wording that you have suggested should go in.
Yep.
Well, it's moved actually within the policy itself about tree preservation orders. Excuse me.
Yes. Okay. I've got that covered.
And you also raised the issue of loss, threat, or damage.
Yes.
It may be more appropriate under F because that's about minimising or mitigating measures, etc., and ensuring that they're in place. But it's just the use of those words and are they clear enough to either an applicant or a decision maker as to exactly what they are and aren't allowed to permit. So if you could just have a look at that. I'm going to bring in Mr. Minot, and then I'll bring in Mr. Ratcliffe, and then I'll bring in Mr. Warden also wants to have a word. So Mr. Minot first, please.
Yeah, so there are similar kinds of issues in relation to some of this. One of the things that struck me about this was this phrase, trees, woodlands and hedgerows. Don't have any problem with protection for trees, woodlands and hedgerows, but there are some odd pieces of wording in when in section A there, I'm talking in terms of the MM73, the rewording. When we're talking about trees, ancient woodlands or hedgerows, I wondered about the location of the adjective ancient, because that suggests all trees, but only ancient woodlands. It seems to me to make more sense if ancient was governing trees and woodlands and hedgerows. I mean, you can have ancient hedgerows just as you can have ancient trees and woodlands. And the point that was being made in terms of the phrases around the landscape, the loss of significant landscape. It also struck me. I mean, again, I have no problem with protecting trees, hedgerows, and woodlands, but there are clearly other landscape features and natural heritage features which could well do with protection and have significant biodiversity value. So, if you're, for instance, talking about constantly flooded open land, I mean, Mr. Ratcliffe, the converse of some of the points that are being made this morning about flood risk, if you've got land which is naturally flooding all of the time, you will have a different biodiversity on that land, because you will have a different particularly in terms of things like flora, and then obviously in terms of things like fauna living on that flora in those landscapes, because of the fact that it's frequently being flooded. It's not necessarily boggy per se, but it's damp ground rather than normal ground. It seems to me that it would be perfectly appropriate to have something which was saying, look, this is also something that could be worth preserving and is something that's worth mentioning in policy. Now, so I was on that train of thought, I started to go back to NE01 and try and work out if that was being covered. So I'm curious as to this focus on trees. Like I say, I have no problem with it. I'm just curious about the things that haven't been mentioned and why there's a reason why they're not being mentioned. And you start to get into the same kind of questions that I asked before just now. If you look at section C, part B, setting out how the details of the proposal have been decided upon in terms of their impact on the value of trees, woodland, hedges. If you've got a site of the kind I was talking about before, and we can talk about a hypothetical site, but a site which has got potentially got biodiversity value washed right across it in some form or other, it's difficult to see how an applicant could tiptoe around the various aspects of that site which have that value, and how the details of the proposal, quote unquote, have been decided on in order to try and avoid the impact on those elements. If you've got a site which is patchy, so there's no biodiversity value, and then there is, you can work your way around it. But it's very difficult to see how you can if the biodiversity is running right across the site. And similarly, when you get onto a section like D, and we're talking about the loss, threat, or damage to any tree, woodland, hedge, that is an extremely powerfully worded policy. It's an extremely powerful wording. I'm all in favour of that level of power in the wording. In the real world, it's very difficult to see. Even when you start talking about the process of seeking to avoid the impact, minimising the impact, and mitigation measures, it raises all sorts of questions, and it raises questions about specific sites. Was there another? Well, hang on a minute. Just section, yeah. And section E, where we're talking about where impacts remain, the need for and benefits of the development in that location must clearly outweigh the loss, threat, or damage. Now, that, to my mind, the use of the words "in that location" is obviously raising the point that clearly development can take place in various different locations. That particular applicant, that particular landowner doesn't necessarily have access to other locations, but if we're talking about protecting natural heritage and biodiversity, development can take place in other locations. How does that raising of that issue about the justifying the benefits of development in that location weigh against the allowance, the permission in the policy of going through the process of saying you look and see if you can avoid the impact, then if you can't avoid the impact, you try and minimise it, and then if you can't do either of those two things, you mitigate. Because if you're mitigating, you can really only mitigate one of the obvious ways in which you could mitigate is doing something elsewhere, but that is no longer that location. Section E is referring to development in that location, and Section E seems to be saying you need to be able to demonstrate within that location, forget about doing anything anywhere else, that the benefits of development outweighs the loss, threat, or damage. And again, if you've got a site of whatever kind which has got potential significant biodiversity value, it becomes very difficult to see how you can do any development on that site, which I'm fully in favour of. I mean, that would be excellent if that's what's really going on. But my problem is the council itself is proposing sites which, in my view, would fall by that criterion, and yet the council are still proposing them, even at this stage in the plan. So again, there's a series of little points there. I don't know if anybody's keeping track. So.
I know. Thank you, Mr. Minor. Can I just bring you back to the focus of what you're trying to say in relation to this policy? What are you saying that needs to be done to this policy to make it sound? Or are you saying this policy is not implementable because you're saying there are elements in there where the council can't implement this?
I'm saying, I'm trying
to understand what your point is.
Yeah,
I'm saying NE03.
NE03. Yeah, I mean, I'm fully in favour of the policy. I would like this to be in the plan. I like the strength of its phrasing. I'm trying to work out which wins when this comes up, as it were, when the unstoppable force comes up against the immovable object. Which of those two things wins? So where you've got two things in the plan which seem to be contradicting one another, I can't work out which wins through that contradictory process. But there was also some points in terms of the wording. I'm wondering whether, I mean, Mr. Shadrevin's already talked about the possibility of deleting some of the phrases that I was referring to. I would be worried if this started to get too eroded. I'm on the side of it not being eroded. I'm on the side of this policy as in NE01 as well. I don't want it to be to be eroded and downgraded. But but my question is how it reflects on other policies. So I'd like, if there are ways of maintaining the strength of this, and potentially, as I say, in terms of my query about why trees, woodlands and hedgerows are being referred to, and whether the ancientness of any of them is, where that is relevant. In some ways, it would be good to see even further strengthening or further clarification as to what's being referred to. So I'm definitely not trying to undermine it.
Well, can I bring in Mr. Ratcliffe and then go to the council? I'll bring in Mr. Ward and then go to the council. I think we just need to refocus on the wording of the policy. Any determination of a planning application is a balance. You're fully aware of this, Mr. Minot, and planning policies are taken into account in accordance with the decisions that are made within each individual council. But what I want to try and focus on here is whether this policy is sound. That's all I'm looking at, is whether any 03 is sound and the wording is sound. So I have raised issues about the wording of the policies I've mentioned. It says trees, woodlands and hedgerows, but then refers to other landscape features, etc. So I'm just trying to determine from the council's perspective whether this is purely just for trees, woodlands and hedgerows, which I haven't got an issue with at all, or whether it should be it's about the purpose of the policy and then the implementation of the policy in relation to assisting the council in determining applications and assisting applicants. So can I bring Mr. Ratcliffe in as well? So Mr. Minot, have you finished your points?
Yeah, I think that's probably me done.
Lovely, thank you. Mr. Ratcliffe, please, and then I'll bring in the council to just provide a response, please.
You're on mute, Mr. Ratcliffe.
I'm not now. I've just got it. I'm ever so sorry about my IT skills.
It is a Friday afternoon, Mr. Ratcliffe, so that's okay.
It's all right. I've written off my life. So the next thing is death. It can't get any worse than that. So anyway, just really picking up on the final points that you made in response to Mr. Minot, and in particular the definitions, and particularly looking at the habitat in the Greenbelt and round here, for example, there's naturally occurring ponds as well, and the type of wildlife that sits in a hedgerow, birds, fowl, nesting in there, is also reliant on ponds. So I do wonder whether the wording should be extended out slightly rather than narrow just to things made of wood. Thank you.
Thank you, Mr. Ratcliffe. Can I bring the council in to respond on that, but also respond to a point? I suppose this is a very chunky policy. So I'm trying to understand why it's quite so long for trees, woodlands and hedgerows, the protection of which I, absolutely agree with. Haven't got an issue with that at all.
I'd be very happy to streamline it.
But it's the wording, and I'm not necessarily saying that it should be streamlined, but it's the wording with it, because it seems to imply that development proposals will be refused if there's any loss, any damage, anything to a single tree, let alone to everything else. And that's not what planning policy states, national planning policy states. Yeah. Now, that could well be the case for a particular ancient tree, and that's absolutely of significant value to a local community, etc., and it's and it's designated as such. So I think rather than and I will bring in Mr. Warden in a minute, but rather than continue discussions on this point, can we ask the council to just rethink this one without diluting the policy in any way in relation to what the policy is trying to achieve, which is the protection of trees, woodlands and hedgerows, but it can't be absolutely every single tree, woodland and hedgerow. It's about the amenity value of those trees, woodlands and hedgerows.
Yeah, absolutely. Yeah.
Mr. Warden, please.
Thank you, Mrs. Wright. No, that was actually my point, particularly in relation to Part A, in the rewording of that, to ensure that it doesn't imply that, because I think it does at the moment. I think in rewording it, I mean that's not really what it's meant to protect every single tree. It means those trees which obviously have significance of value, etc. I'm sure you can find the right wording.
Yes, I'll have a look at it most certainly.
Thank you. Mr. Minot, your hand's still up. Is that?
Yes, apologies. Having answered no when you said whether there was another point, I suddenly realised the other point I was going to make, and specifically in relation to trees, hedges and woodlands, is in relation to areas of regenerating scrub, which is a recognised habitat type. Again, it happens to relate to the R17 site, but there are other sites, for instance, the Officers Meadows site. I haven't been there for quite a while, but I'm aware that the far end of that site had exactly the same kind of characteristics. In the southeast of England, that is a very unusual land type, because clearly you don't usually get bits of open land which have just been left for decades in the southeast without anything going on. In Brentwood, we actually are fortunate enough to have examples of that. There are examples of that in Merrymeads Park, for instance, which is marvellous. But as I say, there's at least 2 sites, even in my knowledge, which are part of the allocated list, which are regenerating scrub. And if we're coming from the biodiversity side, I mean, I'm not entirely sure what the amenity value, whose amenity we're talking about, whether we're talking about the wildlife amenity or human beings amenity. I think it would be worth at least thinking about including that regenerating scrub, or saying something about it, because I think if you were to talk to any wildlife organisation in addition to that, they would certainly say, I mean, you get wildlife organisations that will leave areas.
Isn't that covered by policy NE01? Because you're talking
well,
about
it might be. This is the thing, and I think, you know, Mr. Ratcliffe's point about ponds. The only problem that I've got with NE03 is NE01 is talking in very general terms. NE03 is talking in specific terms, but there are questions about why it's talking about certain things and including those in that specific list, but not also mentioning other things which it might mention. I mean, and then the point that I made earlier on about where the adjective ancient, what it applies to. I think I'm just asking for thought to be given to the inclusion of other things, but I think regenerating scrub is something. It's not specifically mentioned in any council policy, and it would be welcome if it was. I think in wildlife terms.
Thank you, Mr. Minot. Would the council like to respond on that point? Anything further to say?
No, ma'am. Just simply to say you're correct that habitats dealt with under NE01.
Okay, thank you. Can I then move on to NE04? And then after this will be fairly short. After this, we will have a break, and then I hope then the last 2 sessions where I haven't got any participants, I don't intend for those to be exceedingly long sessions. Now, in relation to policy NE04, this is about Thames Chase Community Forest. And there are 2 criteria set out in there. Can I just confirm, is Thames Chase Community Forest area clearly defined on the policies map so that any decision maker and any applicant is clear as to where that is?
I can answer that, and the answer is yes, it's mapped out on the policies map.
Thank you. And it's a set area, it's not changed or anything like that, it's just right. Okay. So is it clear in the first part of the question what is meant by make a positive contribution towards its implementation? What does that actually mean?
I don't know if you want me to answer this, Paul, or...
Yes, by all means.
Just to set the background, Thames Chase Community Forest have an action plan, and the intention is that councils who are within these areas need to, or rather, that there is the expectation that anything we do, we plan positively to not undermine that action plan, which is about increasing canopy cover and forest cover. So the intention, therefore, in the policy was to ensure that development that comes forward, if they are thinking about green infrastructure in line with BE 18, that if they are in this area, that there is that expectation that they are sort of contributing to that action plan and not undermining it.
So is it clear? And I know you set out the aims of the Chase plan. I presume that's the Chase action plan.
Yes, the Thames Chase action plan.
Yeah. You do set that out. So I'm just trying to understand, is it clear as to what this would be? Are you talking financial contributions? Are you talking, non-financial assistance? What exactly does it mean? And is it clear as to what is expected from a developer?
Ma'am, if I may, I think the policy is intended to protect the aims and objectives of the Thames Chase Community Forest. I think the policy should be worded rather differently. It should say development proposals which fall within the Thames Chase Community Forest area shall not prejudice its implementation, aims and objectives. And that's it. I don't think we could require developers to make contributions.
No, that was why I was asking.
Yeah, I just think that they have to be
Obviously
sympathetic in the way in which they deal with their developments, having regard to the existence of the forest and what is being achieved.
Thank you, Mr. Shadravian. Could you have a look at that policy then, please? Because yes, it doesn't quite make sense as it's written. And if you could just have a look at that and then come back with some.
Yes, I will do so. I don't think there's any harm in having B in there, because to have an expectation in this way, I think, is reasonable in a policy like this.
If it's as it says, sort of it's a forest area that requires some form of protection,
yeah,
not in its totality, because development is allowed in the area, but
yeah, there
is a plan there, then it's just trying to ensure that it was this make a positive contribution that I wasn't clear of. So you may
that shouldn't be there.
You may only need to tweak A very slightly to actually.
Yes, that's what I'll do.
Okay, Mr. Warden, please.
Thank you. In respect of the land of the fans partnership, is that what extent of the borough does that cover?
Could Kay help here? Kay.
So I think this is something we might need to come back to you to confirm. But my understanding is that the Lands of the Fan partnership is a much wider partnership, which involves Essex Wildlife Trust, Natural England, the boroughs, and Thames Chase Trust. So it's a bigger partnership that works towards the implementation of the community forest. That we're happy to come back and confirm how that relates to Thames Chase community forest and the Thames Chase Trust, who are the direct charity responsible for the implementation of the plan.
Yeah, because it's not clear whether it applies across the whole borough. It refers to master planning process. I wondered, master planning of what? I mean, it might apply to only certain sites, and those would be large sites generally because of your master planning process. So it's not clear to me actually within the policy as such, but
No, so effectively, it will apply to East Horndon and Dunton. That's the area which it covers. Yeah, there's a possibility of also West Horndon and Brentwood Enterprise Park. So it is a spread around the borough, but we're talking of, sorry? South of the borough, yeah. We are talking about development proposals which fall within the forest area. So that is the geographical sort of extent of it.
Right. Thank you.
Thank you, Mr. Warden. What I'd like to do is have a short break. If we can be back here can we have a short break of 10 minutes, if that's acceptable? So back here at 1:45, and we'll continue with the remaining sessions, so C and G. Thank you.
Thank you, Mel.
All right, thank you, ladies and gentlemen. I'm going to make a start now. And we're coming back on to matter 13C, which is on the historic environment. And I don't have any participants for this session, except for us as inspectors and the council. So no need for any introductions.
I'll exit then, Mrs. Wright. Sorry, I wasn't sure.
Yeah, you can obviously, if you can just turn your camera off. I don't mind you staying in and listening in on the sessions at all, Mr. Ratcliffe.
Okay, thank you. I will.
You're more than welcome to do that, but obviously,
thank you.
Yeah, thank you.
Good.
So, historic environment. We're looking at policies HP 19 to HP 23. Now, our first question queried where the policies sat within the document, and the council's accepted that actually, for clarity, they need to be moved out of the housing section because that doesn't quite make sense. So thank you
That's correct.
For that. And I know that there are some other policies that are proposed to be moved out of the housing section, the ones on design, etc.
Yeah.
Are proposed.
Mum, I'm going to leave my microphone on if that's all right, so we can converse rather than going back and forth.
No, that's fine, because there's nobody else going to be coming in unless my colleague needs to come in or one of your other team members needs to come in. Then that's absolutely fine. Excuse me. So, and I've got no questions on our in relation to the historic environment record. That question has been answered, so we have nothing further to discuss on that. So if we can just move on to our questions 179 to 181 before we then move into the specifics of the actual policies themselves. And these questions related to whether the plan set out a positive strategy for the conservation and enjoyment of the historic environment in accordance with national policy. So can the council just clarify? I know you've set out in your statement that you feel that it does set out. Obviously, you've set out that additional amendments need to be made to some of the policies, just to make sure that collectively those sort of bring the council's overall strategy for the historic environment together. So we will go through those when we start to look at each of the individual policies. Yes. Can I just clarify again about the requirements to produce heritage statements and whether they accord with paragraph 189 of the framework? Because you stated in your hearing statement that subject to some changes, you think that the requirements for producing heritage statements are in accordance with that requirement.
Yes, Ma'am.
And then in response to our question 181, you've said again that some changes to HP 19 are necessary. Yeah, subject to that then our question 181 is then answered positively.
Yeah.
So, Mr. Shadaravian, yeah.
Yeah, I was going to say probably best to start with, not the proposed changes to the policy here in the hearing statement, but
well, there's only
F9A.
In F9A, there's only one change proposed to, there's only changes to one policy proposed, which is HP 19.
That's right. So if we can start with that one,
that would be fine.
Okay.
But yeah, if we can start with that.
That has been amended to accord with the statutory requirements and also the policy requirements of the Secretary of State. So it says that all development proposals affecting designated and non-designated historic assets, including listed buildings and conservation areas, will be required to preserve and enhance. That should be preserve and, where possible, enhance the assets and their settings, including views into and out of conservation areas and their settings. That's because the setting of a conservation area is a policy requirement, not a legal requirement. So that encapsulates the statutory duty and also the policy requirement there in relation to listed buildings and conservation areas.
Thank you. If it can be enhanced where appropriate, because it could be that preservation is enough.
Yes, absolutely. Yes, and enhanced where appropriate is a good choice of words, Ma'am. Thank you.
Yeah. Thank you.
The second paragraph is that the application should be supported be supported by a heritage statement providing sufficient information, etc., as it's set out there. That's to align with the requirements of the MPPF.
Is it that the state? Sorry, Mr. Shadaravian.
No, it's all right.
Is it that the statement should make an assessment of the impact of the development on the significance of the heritage asset and its setting, rather than on the heritage asset, as the wording is set out in B?
Yeah, first of all, you have to assess the significance of the asset in order to understand.
Absolutely, you have to find out what it is.
What level of work you have to do, which is proportionate to that significance. So the statement provides the baseline, if you like, by establishing what the significance of the asset is or its setting, and then the potential impacts of the proposal on the character and significance of the asset and how the proposal has been designed and cited, taking those factors into account. So it's a question of establishing significance, looking to see how significance will be impacted, and then to see what measures are being taken to accommodate those matters. There's a reference there to archaeology as well. So it says a statement should make an assessment of the impact of the development on the heritage asset and its setting, the level of harm that results, and how any impacts will be mitigated in accordance with guidance issued by central government in historic England from time to time. So it's important that there's a reference to that, because the historic England guidance, of course, is quite detailed and very well considered, and that is used by local authorities as something of a Bible, frankly, when one comes to consider these statements and what the level of assessment and detail should be. Provide clear justification for any works that would lead to any harm to a heritage asset through a detailed analysis, and then the remainder of the policy remains the same. What the policy doesn't do is set out the tests which govern development management decisions. And I think we probably need to consider those under the following policies. So the objective of HP 19, therefore, is to protect historic assets and their settings. So that sets the baseline, and also sets out the requirement for the information to be provided with any application that may affect any such asset or its setting. So that, if you like, is the protection and the first stage dealt with under that policy.
Okay, thank you. So take me through policy HP 20.
Well, there's no proposal to amend this in F9A.
No.
Just bear with me. As originally drafted, there is a degree of repetition here because it talks about heritage statements again, when that's already been dealt with in HP 19. But it goes on to deal with any changes of use or any works of alteration. A positive approach in terms of permitting alterations or changes of use where this will contribute towards the restoration, retention or maintenance of the listed building and group of buildings, whilst preserving the historic, I don't know what spatial means, but historic or structural integrity of the building or its setting. So this assumes that there will be no impact on the listed building or its setting. So it supports anything that is positive and doesn't have an impact. So it has to preserve its structural integrity and its historic significance. I think that could be better worded. Then it goes on, proposals for the alteration or extension of listed buildings will only be permitted where these are sympathetic to the building's character and appearance, and where the features of special architectural or historic interest are preserved, restored or complemented. Now, I think there's a difficulty with that paragraph because obviously proposals for the alteration or extension of a listed building might well be regarded as constituting less than substantial harm, which would then have to meet the policy tests of the MPPF. So my proposal.
So it's that hierarchy, isn't it? Again.
Yeah. So you absolutely. So you will see that in the evidence, our evidence, we've put in a different C.
Yes.
Where we start talking about less than substantial harm. Now, this all gets very complicated because then we go on to deal with conservation areas separately as well. And I don't think there's any harm in separating out the development management issues in relation to listed buildings and conservation areas. But what we've got to make sure is that these statements in these policies, what the council is prepared to support and what it's not prepared to support, is fully compliant with statutory requirements and the requirements of the MPPF. So in order to cut a long story short, bearing in mind that our evidence in response to your questions actually does result in some fairly substantial proposed changes to HP 20, I'm going to suggest that, if you don't mind, that I take these policies back with me this week as well, along with the Green Belt policies this coming week, and restructure these to make sure that they fully accord with the MPPF and statutory requirements. And insofar as they assist in providing the positive environment which the MPPF exalts in relation to the preservation, not only the preservation and enhancement of these assets, but also their enjoyment by the community to be used positively, I will make sure that the policies highlight those matters as well, albeit separately within each of the policies. So I'm not suggesting wholesale changes. What I want to make sure is that there is no overlap between HP20 and HP21 and HP19, which deals with basic protection and the first stage of development management, and make sure that both HP20 and 21 are entirely consistent with national policy and the Listed Buildings Act.
Thank you for that. That would actually be most welcomed.
Because otherwise, I think you're going to find it difficult, actually, to come back with any observations with respect to proposed modifications unless I undertake that exercise.
Yes, I think that would be a wise move at this stage. Although obviously, I'm a little bit disappointed that it hasn't been that wasn't thought through before now, because obviously the consistency with national policy is always going to be an issue that inspectors are going to raise at the first hurdle.
Yes.
But I very much appreciate the council's approach of wanting to assist us in trying to come forward with some amended policy there. If it can, as far as possible, stick to the wording that's set out in the policies, but obviously where absolutely necessary, I totally agree that if elements need to be changed, they need to be changed to ensure consistency. Then we will look into that.
I'm not proposing a wholesale change to them.
And I appreciate that. You
just got to make sure that they are compliant.
So, yeah.
That's the important thing.
That'd be really useful. So in that vein then, unless Mr. Warden, you've got any particular questions you want to make on HP20 and HP21, I'm proposing to just skip over HP21 then in relation to the conservation areas, because I think it's very much down to, is it consistent with national policy? Does it conflict with, these were my questions, does it conflict with HP19 or etc.? So I'd like to move on to HP22 then in that case.
Very good.
Mr. Warden, do you?
No, I don't.
No,
Mrs.
nothing
Wright,
to add. Right, thank you.
So sorry, Mum. Just before we leave these, in terms of timescales, I'm reviewing the green belt policies for compliance. I will do these at the same time, so you will have them by the end of next week.
I very much appreciate that. Thank you. Thank you. So can we just have a look at the local heritage assets, because this is slightly different in terms of national policy. So can I just understand the council's approach to local heritage assets? So these are. Sorry, these.
To help you with this.
Lovely, thank you. So, Ms. Polaris, so these are the, you call them local heritage assets, which is absolutely fine. It's not an issue necessarily calling them that, as long as it's very clear within the policy or within the supporting text as to what that means. Obviously, in national policy, it's non-designated heritage assets, which I know we're not looking at the proposed or the suggested changes in the hearing statement, but that's what has been suggested. So could you just let me know, do you have a local heritage list of non-designated heritage assets, etc.? And could you just take me through the approach of the policy towards these particular assets, please?
So the intention of the policy was to ensure that any local non-designated heritage assets were also given consideration as part of any development. I think my colleague needs to confirm the local list, but in terms of sort of other locally designated, sort of local non-designated heritage assets such as protected lanes, is something that we highlight in this policy as well as something that we would like to be protected. So it's really there to ensure that it's our local assets are also given some consideration when development comes forward. So I'm actually told that there's no local list currently, but it's being worked on. So there is.
So in relation to the wording that's set out in HP 22, in our MIQ question in 185, we asked the question about what a local heritage asset is and also what is meant by a general presumption in favour of the retention of local heritage assets and whether that was consistent with national policy. So I will, for this purpose, just refer to the suggested changes that are set out within your hearing statement, because I think it does provide some greater clarity on those points. Because you're then turning it into a positive policy, which is good. Subject to, and then you've got a subject to the heritage statement and what comes out of that, and appropriate harm and loss of the asset and setting is proportionate to significance, etc. And that's also where you put in a specific reference about protected lanes are already in there. They're in the submitted policy under C, but you're proposing to move that into B. And you're removing some sort of statements that are set out. So in the instance of this policy, the suggested changes that are set out in your hearing statement at the moment, and we would need to look at them in a little bit more detail, but just having a look at them now, and we need to look at the context of how they apply to HP 19 as well. It does make more sense, and certainly is more consistent and does appear to be more effective as set out in your hearing statement. So again, Mr. Shadowraven, if you can just clarify, because it mentioned is reference is made to policy HP 19 in there.
Yeah.
So if you can just ensure there is consistency across the board with that policy, that would be very useful. Thank you. If we can just then move on to HP 23, which is the archaeological policy. Again, can the council give, in relation to the submitted plan, wording? Is this consistent with national policy in relation to what it's trying to achieve for scheduled monuments and archaeological remains? You've put forward suggested changes in your hearing statement on this. If I can just understand the council's approach, and then no, don't worry.
So I'm getting a bit tired now.
I know what you mean. So we're almost there now.
So apologies for my tardiness.
That's fine.
I think, as proposed in HP 20, in response to question 187, what is proposed there is a lot better than was originally drafted. The requirement that all development which materially affects the scheduled monument will only be permitted where the council is satisfied that the requirements of policy HP 19 are met is fine. In addition, where proposals results in substantial harm to its significance or loss, the applicant will need to demonstrate wholly exceptional circumstances. Again, that aligns with the MPPF. So I think that goes as far as it needs to. The positivity comes next. Planning permission will be granted for development affecting archaeological sites where it can be demonstrated it conserves the significance of the archaeological interest, and therefore requiring full archaeological assessment in relation to sites that possess the potential to have those remains. So it keeps it simple, to the point, it aligns with the MPPF, and I suggest to you, Ma'am, that the proposed wording in that answer is probably appropriate.
In comparison to some of the wording that's set out in the submitted HP 23, that is a necessary requirement for soundness to ensure consistency with national.
So again, again, I'll align that with HP 19, make sure it all goes together.
Thank you. Thank you for that. Now, I haven't any further questions on the historic environment, so we are nearly coming to the end here. So, Mr. Warden, do you have any further questions?
No, thank you, Mrs. Wright.
Thank you. So, if we can come on to the last section, which is 13G from this morning, which is on design and the design policies. And the council here is relying predominantly on the or suggested changes that are set out in F9A, rather than any significant changes being set out in, or any significant further changes being set out in the hearing statement, which is welcome. Thank you for that. I suppose my first question is if the council could just explain the reason behind so many design related policies and what they're trying to achieve, because there's quite a number of them. So I'm trying to sort of, and I know, notwithstanding that you have suggested the deletion of two of them, which is HP 15 and HP 18, there are still a number of design policies that would remain. So as we go through the policies, if you can just bear that in mind, I just want to understand whether there is consistency between the policies, whether they confuse, whether they are effective in their own right and absolutely necessary, or whether an amalgamation would make more sense. And I'm not necessarily proposing that's the route we would prefer to go down, but I just want to understand what each policy is trying to achieve. So if we can go to HP 12, so I don't know if the council just wanted to say why there are lots of policies on design first, or whether you just want to go straight into the policies. I don't mind.
I'd rather not address why there are so
Should we just
many.
go straight into the policies, Mr. Shadoravian? I think that may be best, mightn't it?
Okay.
And we may get to the bottom of that by actually going through the policies.
Okay.
So HP 12. So as set out in the submitted plan, these are a list of council objectives, really. So it's a statement of objectives. But in F9A, then you propose.
F9A, it's amended to plan for and build inclusive environments that supports our that support our residents and communities. Council will require new development proposals to provide access to good quality community spaces, services and amenities, and infrastructure that accommodate, encourage and strengthen communities and social interaction for all users. The interaction is felt to be important because that's a question of how development allows people to relate to each other. So the way in which you design open spaces, the way where you may put areas for sitting and meeting and congregation, for example. Create places that foster, again, that's a matter which arises in the latest Design for Healthy Lives. Create places that foster a sense of belonging in community, where individuals and families can develop and thrive. Ensure that streets and public spaces are planned for everyone to move around to spend time in comfort and safety. So it's comfort, safety and convenience which are important to this aspect. But particularly having regard to the disabled or impaired, who need to be treated very sympathetically within developments for obvious reasons. D, ensure buildings and places are designed in a way that everyone, regardless of their age, income, ethnicity, etc., can use the buildings and places confidently, independently and with dignity and without engendering a sense of separation or segregation, and ensure that new buildings and spaces are designed to reinforce inclusivity of neighbourhoods and are resilient and adaptable to changing community requirements. So all extraordinarily laudable objectives, and we're dealing here essentially with the quality of life and inclusivity.
How are they to be implemented? How is a decision maker to determine through when an application comes in that it creates a place that fosters a sense of belonging, for instance?
By the way in which the proposals are designed and laid out, and how the layout and design affects the way in which people use the development. So I'll give you an example, if I may. I lost an appeal up in Suffolk very recently on the basis of a design which followed particular principles with all the houses facing east. And I won't go into the reasons why, but the inspector there, after we had a 4-day inquiry, the inspector there found that the layout of the houses and the effect of having side elevations, albeit well fenestrated, side elevations onto the road, pavement and road, would be inimical to that sense of community, because there'd be no activity on the street front. They'd be going down side roads rather than main streets. That's the kind of thing one would take into account. And he also found that because of the layout and the reliance upon side roads or walkways, that people on the periphery of the development or living just outside the new development would feel intimidated about walking through the development, and therefore there would be a disincentive to integrate. So those are the kinds of factors which we take into account.
So moving on to policy HP 13 then.
Yes.
How does HP 12 sort of interact with, and HP 14, etc. as well, but we'll come on to those. As how do the other design policies relate to, how do they interact in relation to an applicant coming in and seeing what they need to consider in bringing their proposal forward, and then giving certainty to a decision maker?
Can we work from the F9A proposed changes?
Yeah.
to HP 13. So the developer considers what is going to be provided. The objectives of HP 12 are taken forward further in HP 13. So the proposals will be required to meet high design standards. So as well as providing the opportunities which are encompassed in HB 12, you do so by providing high quality, high design standards. I think there's some duplication there in the fact that it's also talking about safe, inclusive and attractive and accessible places.
I think this is my point.
Yes, absolutely.
That repetition in policy.
Yeah. And so that needs to come out probably.
Well, can you just take me through, because there's an awful lot in HP 13 in that policy, and I'm not proposing that you take me through the entire policy. I can obviously read that for myself, but there are some proposed amendments that are set out in F9A, and I just want to understand why those amendments have been made and why they need to be in that policy.
Well, we're talking about creating successful policies, building on the objectives of HP 12, and this drills down into a little more detail. So the
I suppose I'm asking, are the additional elements justified, or are they set out elsewhere within policies? So you've got about open spaces, for instance. You've got about trees.
Yeah, we've tried to rationalise them by deleting quite a large number. So those that remain require the mitigation to mitigate the impact of air, noise, vibration, light pollution from internal and external sources. Those are matters which obviously are dealt with in other policies, thinking about it. So there might be a need to review that. I'm not quite sure what safeguard the living environments of future occupants and any nearby residential properties.
No, I don't know what that means either.
The living environments, because we're talking here about
properties don't have living environments.
Yeah. So, but we are obviously concerned to ensure that whatever development takes place, that the amenities of existing and future occupants are protected from intrusion by noise or vibration, etc. But I think those matters are dealt with in other development management policies. To successfully to integrate functional needs such as storage, refuse, recycling, bicycles and car park, etc. All issues that need to be taken into account in designing successful places. Again, considering how the natural environment can be effectively integrated into and enhanced by development, by the inclusion of features which will endure for the life of the development, enhancing biodiversity, etc., is a laudable objective. I don't think it does any harm to have it set out here.
Could you could the council just clarify whether this is just duplicating existing policies? Again, not necessarily a soundness issue, depending upon the purpose of the policy, but also the consistency, because that's always the issue, is that where things are duplicated or repeated, that there can be a change that may be hasn't, it is not necessarily how it is set out in a different policy. So if you can look at consistency and duplication to just see whether these are justified, please. I think that would be really, really helpful.
And that applies actually to the whole suite of policies. Because
funny enough, yes, it does.
It does, because there is overlap between these policies as well and other policies which we've already discussed in the examination.
Yes.
So I'm going to. This is not something I will do. It's something which the officers will do. They need to go through these to see what's been dealt with in other policies in the plan, and then to rationalise these policies, maybe to reduce them to maybe 2 or 3 in number at most, and deal with the issues which are there. And we can use as our starting point HP 12, which sets the framework for inclusivity.
Thank you.
So that would mean then, in undertaking that exercise, looking at all policies up to HP 16.
HP 16. Yes, I mean, HP 14, I don't understand that policy at all.
No.
So I don't actually see a purpose for that at all. It seems to be, again, objectives or some statement. Mr. Warden, please.
Thank you, Mrs. Wright. I just checked back to the Dunton Hills policy, which I know we're going to come on to at another session. So it's not really a soundness issue because that policy isn't specifically detailed on design. So I would assume that these principles would apply to Dunton Hills, but I would expect the council then to, looking at this, would check back on the emergent work on Dunton Hills, so there's a clear relationship between what in the plan is the single biggest new community reflects these design issues. So there needs to be some consistency through the plan in relation to how, through the master planning of Dunton Hills, these principles would be taken forward, if I'm making myself clear.
No, you are, and we need to consider this in relation probably to all housing allocations, because we will want to make sure that however these are rationalised, that they can be applied effectively to all allocations, including Dunton Hills. And if there's anything specific in the Dunton Hills allocation which is not dealt with here, then that is highlighted. And certainly we want to make sure that they're consistent.
Yes.
I accept that.
Yes.
Great. Thank you. So sort of on that note, recognising that you've put forward some deleted policies anyway, including HP 15. Then I'm not proposing to discuss policies up to HP 16 any further. If you're going to be looking at rationalising that element and seeing what is consistent and what isn't across those to provide that effectiveness and clarity. So if we can just move on to HP 17 before, which is the last policy we're going to look at, because the council is proposing to delete HP 18, which we don't have any issues with. In that sense, is that because those elements are covered, or necessary elements are covered in the other policies?
They're all covered elsewhere, Mom. Absolutely.
All covered, so it's just duplication again.
It's all duplication.
Okay, thank you. That's what we thought, but it's good to get clarification on that. So the final policy, which is the paving over front gardens. and it's just ensuring that that policy is perfectly clear as to what it's trying to achieve and its consistency and justification, really. And there is a suggested change, I think, in your statement. I don't think there's anything in F9A. No, there isn't. So it's in your actual statement. Oh, it's a supporting text. You're proposing. You've just proposed some suggested changes there, just to clarify that.
Yeah.
So. Mr. Warden, please.
Just a question about whether is there evidence that suggests that this is a particular issue in Brentwood?
Paving over front gardens. I think there are instances of this in Brentwood. It's not just Brentwood, of course. It's everywhere where the car reigns supreme in neighbourhoods, and all this is doing is trying to prevent a proliferation of what already is a bit of an issue. So I don't need to tell you what impact it has on visual amenity and on the pleasantness of neighbourhoods when front gardens go to paving and cars. So it's there just trying to protect the visual amenity and visual quality of neighbourhoods.
Thank you.
Thank you, Mr. Warden. On that note, I've come to the end of our questions on matter 13G on design and placemaking. You'll be pleased to hear. So we've hit before 5 o'clock, which is always a bonus on a Friday afternoon. So thank you very much for I know not everybody is obviously in the meeting now, but thank you very much for your contributions today and for giving us food for thought, as we'll call it, something to think about as well, and for going away and making necessary considerations on certain policies. So thank you for offering to do that. We do appreciate that.
Well, we're also very grateful for your and Mr. Warden's patience as well today.
Thank you. That's no problem at all.
Thank you.
So what I'd like to do then is just to finish this session now and say thank you again. And we are back in session on if I'm correct, it's the 23rd of February. Sorry, just looking at my calendar there. 23rd of February, when we will be looking at the transport matter 12A. Now, just as we're going to be looking at the programme again. So just to see, because now we may be bringing parts of air quality into that discussion, we may just look to see whether we need to just add on some additional time to that session. But we'll have a think about that. But just so that you're aware. But we would be doing Dunton Hills in the afternoon anyway. So it could be that we just bring air quality in, but air quality in relation to Dunton Hills as well. And we just bring it, sort of amalgamate it into that one day, first day. Then the second day is Dunton Hills in relation to the policies as well. Okay, but we'll let you know if there is a change on that. So thank you.
Thank you very much. Thank you.
Thank you very much. And we'll see you then.
Thank you very much.
Have a good weekend.
Thank you, sir.
Bye.
And you too.
Bye.
Bye-bye.